Great. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. I had my hotel and flights booked to come to the first OTESA in Toronto 2020, and then we all know what happened. I'll say I'm a big hockey fan, ice hockey fan, so I was looking forward to coming to Canada, maybe catching some games. It's an amazing lineup we've got there. You should be really proud of the team who've put it together. I'm looking forward to that. We've been having some behind-the-scenes keynote chats between me, Sherry, Maha, and Brenna. So I'm also glad I'm going first because I know their keynote's going to be really amazing. So at least I don't have to compete with those. You know, I can get mine out of the way first. I'd also like to say I think we should give a big sort of thanks to Valerie. I know it's a team effort, but I've organised conferences before, and they're hard work. I can't imagine what it's like to be trying to organise a conference while simultaneously trying to create the whole organisation and structure that's going to organise it. That's just incredible, and it needs someone to kind of really drive that stuff. So amazing work, well done, Valerie. Cool. So I'm going to be talking about metaphors of EdTech. I'm hoping to have some fun with this, but also there is some serious points in this. But hopefully there'll be some. So don't get confused by the lightheartedness. Doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't some serious points in there. So here's what I'm going to talk through. I've got a good hour, so I can meander a bit. I'm going to talk about first. I want to take a narrative detour, and before we get to metaphors, and sort of talk about some other work I've done, which is more about the role of narrative to understand things. Then I'm going to talk about what the role of metaphors are for us as human beings, and then why they might be useful in educational technology. And I'll give the online pivot, I think, as an example there. I think about why it's good to have these ways of thinking. It's a fairly long talk. We've got a good time. That's a bit of a little intermission to stand up, move around, have a comfort break. Intermission involves penguins dancing to jazz. So if there's nothing else in this talk, you get to see penguins dancing to jazz. That's useful. I'm going to go through some metaphors then that I think just to kind of pull out as examples, really, even if you don't like those particular metaphors, they're kind of meant to demonstrate how you can use these things. Although I've kind of been, up to that point, I've been pretty positive about the role of metaphors. I think it's important to acknowledge some of their limitations and dangers even, and then some conclusions and discussion, hopefully. So that's the aim. As I say, it's a fairly long talk. It's not just a 20-minute chat. So I'm going to need you to be interactive at some point, just to kind of break it up. No one wants to hear me talk for an hour or so. So we'll try and make it a bit interactive. So get your interactive hats on, be ready to go. As an example, not now, but later, I'm just giving you a pre-warning. I'm going to ask you to give me your best or worst EdTech metaphors. You can start thinking about that now, and I'll prompt you later. But I'm giving you a heads up just so when we get there, it's not kind of all quiet and tumbleweed. So start thinking about your best and worst EdTech metaphors, or even just education metaphors. I think Terry's given me the intro. I work in the Institute of Educational Technology. I'm the director of the OER Hub and GoGM, which are research projects around open educational resources and PhD students in the area. I also chair the Open Programme at Open University, which is our multidisciplinary degree. So that allows students to combine over 250 different modules to create their own pathways and create their kind of unique degree. And I mention that because I think it's an interesting take on what openness means. People often don't think of that as openness, that kind of flexibility. It's also a really interesting example of how, when we come to talk about the online pivot, people have just sort of gone for the online lecture model. But actually, by being a much more asynchronous university, so the Open University is fully distance education, it frees you up to do different things. So the reason we can combine all these 250 different modules is because we're freed from the tyranny of the timetable. We haven't got to try and allocate different things and organise timetables around when people go to lectures, because most of our study is asynchronous. So I think it's an example of how you get those advantages when you sort of can think differently. That's me on Twitter. That's my blog. And this is the slides available on Google there. I think it should be open if I haven't missed the sharing up. So if you want to go and hack around with these later, you can. Good. So this is the narrative detour. So mainly this keynote is just an exercise in self-promotion. So let's just accept that and move on. So I'm going to be talking about a book I've written called Metaphors of EdTech. But before that, I wrote a book called 25 Years of EdTech. So I want to talk about that because partly it relates to the Metaphors book. And in some ways, they're kind of two sides of the same coin about how we come to understand educational technology. McCloskey here proposed there are two dominant ways by which people come to understand a topic. And that's either through metaphor or narrative or models and histories, if you like. And they proposed that different fields tend to be dominated by one mode. So physics by metaphor and biology, so by narrative. So I think my two books, 25 Years of EdTech and Metaphors of EdTech, can be seen as those two models, really, kind of as a way to come to a topic and approach that topic. So I wrote this book, 25 Years of EdTech, a few years ago, 2019, I think, came out. It's published by the fantastic Athabasca University Press, thank you. So it's openly licensed and available free for download if you want. You can buy the printed copy, obviously. But I think really interestingly, because it's openly licensed, you can do interesting things with it. So Clint Lalonde, who some of you may know, I don't know if Clint's here, got in touch with me, said they wanted to do an audiobook version of it. So he corralled a bunch of people to kind of each of them reading a different chapter of it, which was then released on a weekly schedule. And then Laura Pasquini said she wanted to do a podcast, so get people in to chat about each of the chapters after the audio version came out. And actually, I think the audio book and the podcast are more interesting than the book in many ways. It's kind of allows that discussion around a topic. And that happens because it's openly licensed. It's much more difficult to do if it's not openly licensed. I think it's just an example of what that kind of being open allows. And hopefully the Metaphors book will be out in June 22. I'm just going through some of the last minute queries now and spotting all those mistakes that I've made ages ago. So the 25 Years of EdTech book. So by the way, these graphics on the side, you can make your own ones. This is the cover of the book, but I work with a really excellent artist called Brian Mathers, who some of you may know, and he created a remixer. So you can go in and you can change the color of it, but also the words above the glasses and the text down below. So EdTech, not invented last week, was one of the ones I did. So so when I wrote the book, I was at the time I was the president of the Association for Learning Technology in the UK, which is kind of similar to OTESA in Canada. So a membership organisation for learning technologists, and it was the 25th year in 2018. And so on my blog, I said, stupidly, you say you're going to do these things before you realise how much work it's going to be. I said I'm going to choose a technology every year from 1994. And it was just like a kind of fun thing to do. It was based on my experience. And I tried to think that when they became significant technologies, so not necessarily when they're invented, it could be some time. And I created this blog series, sort of made it through to the end. And by the time I got to the end, I thought, hey, we may as well turn that into a book. So I got in touch with Athabasca, who very kindly agreed to publish it. I think perhaps the most interesting thing about the book is in some ways about why I chose to write it. And I think, and this also comes on to some of the work on the metaphor stuff. So I think educational technology is a field that lots of people, or learning technology is a field lots of people move into from other fields. An example I give is, maybe I'm doing chemists a disservice here, but an example I give is if you went to a chemistry conference and you were having lunch with random people at a table, most of them would have a chemistry PhD, you think. If you go to an educational technology conference and you're having lunch with random people, then there might be people there with a history PhD, a philosophy PhD, a computer science PhD. So a very kind of interdisciplinary area. People come to it from different areas. And that's a real richness, I think, about the area. But it does mean people don't have a kind of shared understanding and common knowledge of what's gone before often. So I wanted to kind of provide some basis for that, I think. So that was a kind of a positive aim. The other ones were often just me ranting about things. So I kind of get annoyed about this stuff. We've seen it with online pivots I've come to, but I've seen it a lot. So I've been around this area for quite some time, and in 2012, which was the year of the MOOC, the people were saying like, we've invented online learning. And you're like, really? Again? And I launched the Open University's first fully online course in 1999 with like 15,000 students. So it was a surprise to find that e-learning had only just been invented there. So I wanted to kind of demonstrate that higher education has this history of innovation, and we often kind of forget it, and it's often seen that it's people from outside who've come in and done stuff. I wanted to kind of see if by taking this approach we could then draw out themes and lessons maybe for going forward, and to highlight the necessity of a critical approach. It's not just about isn't everything amazing, but to kind of think critically about these things. And I think most of all to kind of provide this alternative historical narrative to that. We often see this kind of year zero one. It's like everything's only just been invented now, or people claim to be coming in disrupting the scene with things that have gone before and have a long history. So it was just my scream into the void sometimes. And this is, I think Brian summed this up in this cartoon here, this kind of sense of historical amnesia, I think, that often surrounds education technology. So we've invented online learning again, and again. And it always seems to be the same claims coming out. I'm not going to go through all these. This is just kind of show these are the ones I covered. So it goes from bulletin board systems, quite big things like the web, cover things like Second Life. So they're not always good things. So I mentioned blockchain just because, not because I think it's a good idea in EdTech, but just suddenly why was everyone talking about it? What was it meant? What was the problem that was meant to be solved? So these are the ones that I covered, if you're interested. And I thought it was interesting when I didn't know this before I went into it, but when I looked back over that sort of stream, that kind of narrative, I thought I could detect three phases in many ways. So I think the first phase was very optimistic. I remember going to conferences around 95, 96, when e-learning was very new. People were really using it to think differently about how can we teach? What's the best way to teach? There was lots of talk about constructivism, pedagogies, and non-linear text, ways to approach stuff, and people were kind of really energized by e-learning. And then we kind of entered a mainstream of it with things like the LMS or VLE, where kind of these enterprise systems and kind of large-scale production, I think, and then in sort of social media. And I think the more recent phase has been much more of a kind of critical thinking about educational technology, and the last chapter in the book is about this kind of dystopian turn we've had. And in many ways, that dystopian turn has been there for a long time, but I think it's kind of hard to ignore that. And we've seen examples more recently as well, for example, with proctoring software. So I think it's interesting to kind of see this narrative stream that we've gone through. And I sometimes think I'd like to, maybe there was some naive optimism, but I think also there was some interesting stuff in the early work that with people kind of really trying to rethink how we teach. And I think maybe when we went into the mainstream phase, we lost some of that innovation and excitement. And I think maybe there's a place for that now that we've gone through the online pivot to try and recapture that. So that's just a kind of, that's the narrative approach to education technology for now. I'm now going to actually come on to the main point of the talk, which is about metaphors. So first of all, to kind of just think about metaphors in general. So one of the kind of foundational works in metaphors was by Lakoff and Johnson's Metaphors We Live By. And they were kind of really important about stating the significance of metaphors to us as human beings. They sort of say, it's not just for poets in this work, it's, we often heard that's what metaphors were for, but actually they're fundamental to our kind of whole mental construct. And they go through really good examples of how we use these things in language often without you noticing that we're using them, and they really shape how we think about topics. And this guy Svard mentions that metaphors are the most primitive, most elusive, and yet amazingly informative objects of analysis. There was a kind of a lot of excitement about investigating metaphors in psychology from in the 80s onwards. And here metaphor is a kind of super category that covers things like simile, analogy for non-literal use of language. So they're not just kind of literary tools to kind of make a point, but actually they shape our language and thinking in very fundamental ways. And so often we don't notice they're there, and you have to kind of bring them to the light, I think, to kind of notice how they're influencing your thinking. So given that they have this kind of quite important role, there's it's important to think about how they work. So the kind of basic way of a metaphor works is you have a source domain and a target domain, and you map elements across from one to the other. You don't map all elements across because then it would be the same thing. So to take a common metaphor that's actually quite flawed, but if we get, people know it, people talk about the structure of the atom, which would be your target domain, is like the structure of the solar system. So people know the structure of the solar system. So it's like an atom has a large thing at the center and things circling around it. And that image is, in some ways, to become one of the defining characteristics of how people think about atoms. But actually, it proved to be quite difficult because it was wrong in many ways. From a quantum perspective, that kind of shows how metaphors can also limit how we think. So this is how you come to understand something new. You don't know the target domain, you know a source domain, and you can use it for teaching to kind of help people understand that new domain. So metaphors have kind of real power. So the first thing they allow us to do is kind of mapping from source to target domain. But also there's this idea of a generative metaphor, which is more like a dialogue between both elements. You may not actually know much about either element. I think that's true of some of the examples I've used in my book. So I've got an example which is about a local castle to me, a Welsh castle. Now, I'm guessing most of you won't be fabulously familiar with the history of Welsh castles, but I use that to talk about some aspects about why educational technology is an appealing business prospect for people. And it's really that kind of dialogue between the two that's important. And that's the point in this quote here, that it's the interaction between these two fields that's the most important thing, and that is the creation of a novel meaning. I think one of the things that's also really interesting, and it's almost why I wanted to kind of think of writing this book as a matter of defense for us people who work in education technology. When you're presented to things as a metaphor, it shapes how you think. And if you're presented as a problem in a metaphorical sense, then it will shape the solution that you use. So these people did some research, and they had two groups of subjects, and they talked to them about crime either in the metaphor as a disease or in a metaphor as a monster. And those two groups came to very different solutions about how you should approach the problem of crime in a local community based on how it had been shaped to them. And I think that's important for us in educational technology, because often if people are trying to sell you something, they'll present it to you in a metaphor that seems to make their solution seem like the obvious answer to the problem they've posed. And so I think being able to spot when you're being sold a metaphor is actually a really important thing to do. So the reason why I think metaphors are useful in education technology then are, first of all, just the kind of often use of metaphors as a means of understanding. Education technology is still quite a new field. What is it like? How is it like these things? How is it not like these things? So they provide a useful means to help us to understand that. That point I just made kind of about defense, being able to spot when you're being sold a metaphor, I think, or how it's being used by politicians to shape debates amongst education things. I think it's a really important skill to develop. And lastly, I think fun. Who remembers fun? I think metaphors allow you to kind of think about technology in a creative manner. And also, I think it kind of helps humanize how we approach education technology. And often I think particularly during the pandemic, many of us were caught up in, trying to just get stuff working, developing roadmaps and spreadsheets and stuff, it's like to try and get it out there and run it. And that's useful, but it can be a bit kind of soul sapping, I think. And I think metaphors allow us to kind of think about this stuff in a new way and hopefully a fun way, which I hope we'll get to do today. And speaking of fun, I hope this works. So I've created a metaphor generator. That's my dog Tylo, and so I hope the website doesn't crash. So if you go to metaphor.edtechie.net, just click on the give me another button and it will give you a metaphor for technology. So it kind of works by basically pulling the metaphor as the first thing, that which would be like your source domain, and is as a metaphor for the second thing, which would be the target domain, which is an educational technology. I want to say thanks to Alan Levine, who helped me with the program for this. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to go and ping that and stick the ones you like in the chat. Maha was doing this online the other day and came up with a good one about quantum physics as a metaphor for exam proctoring, wasn't it, Maha? So I think that, and actually with that, people had a really good discussion online about, oh yeah, it's kind of like, as soon as you measure stuff, you change behaviour. So that was really, really fun. So I think sometimes they're just fun, but I think sometimes they can lead to quite interesting discussion. While I'm in presentation mode, I can't actually see the chat, so I'm hoping that someone will shout out some interesting ones to me.
What does quantum physics tell us about blogging?
Yeah, see, if I was really brave, I wouldn't have a talk at all. What I do is I just let people ping stuff there, and I'd riff off it. But I'm not really brave, so I don't do that. But you could think, yeah.
Use the Loch Ness Monster myth as a metaphor for artificial intelligence.
Well, that is good, isn't it? We're always trying to find it. Some people really believe it's there and it works, and we keep returning to it. And I think you could riff off that one quite well.
Do you want another one?
Yeah, go give me another one, and then
okay. What does the structure of a typical horror film tell us about mobile learning?
Okay, right, yeah. So a typical horror film has a structure. There's often the final girl who survives at the end. So how would that relate to mobile learning? Maybe around, people, and also actually, there's a good one there because in horror films they always have to isolate people, so they often don't have mobile phones. It's kind of like there's something about they want to remove the technology to simplify the story, and maybe there's something there about people wanting to remove devices from classrooms to kind of simplify the narrative structure. Does that sound good, Terry? Convinced?
Yeah. Yes.
Cool. Thank you for everyone for engaging there, and carry on playing with it if you want, and ping some on Twitter. So coming on to the Metaphors of EdTech book. So again, going to be published by Athabasca, opening license coming in June 22. I worked with Brian Mathers again on the cover. So we'll come on to it later. One of the chapters is about JAWS, the film JAWS, as a metaphor for education technology. And I'll be honest, it's quite a torturous metaphor, but I really wanted to get in there primarily because I'm a real JAWS fan, primarily so I could then have a cover with JAWS in it. So I should put a link. I've even set up a shop for this game. It's no profit shop, so you can buy the T-shirt, the mug, which I do have. So who wouldn't want a T-shirt with that one? Cool. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the online pivots. I think it kind of relates to the idea of metaphors. So during 2020, I think UNESCO said something like at one point over 80% of all education has shifted online to some degree, which really kind of meant that education technology moved center stage. And many of you who work in that also find that suddenly, your phone was ringing off the hook, and all those people who you could never get a meeting with before were suddenly saying, "Help us! We need to do stuff." And so some ways that was good, and some ways you could see that it was good from an education technology point of view. You could see how that kind of helped boost the profile of things. But I think also kind of really revealed a lot of ignorance about online education. And so here's a quote from last, I think it was Inside Higher Ed, that's right. And so the main reason why distance learning revolution didn't replace the traditional models, online learning just isn't as good. So they're continually operating with this lecture deficit model. Like the lecture is the only way to learn, and anything that's not the lecture is therefore of lower quality. And I thought, having worked in distance education university for a long time and done lots of online learning, that kind of really revealed a lack of alternative mental cognitive models that people had about online learning. The only way to do it was to stream video lectures, and I think that was a kind of very valid thing to do when often people only had 2 weeks to suddenly shift the stuff online. Of course, you're going to do this kind of emergency pivot in a way, but I think now we've kind of been through that phase. There's an opportunity here to kind of think more realistically and excitingly about what we can do online, and I hope the metaphors give us a method to do that. So I don't know if you've had these kind of headlines in Canada, but it's basically, online learning having saved higher education, we should note. It's like now portrayed as some kind of evil. It's like with headlines like universities refuse to end online lessons. It's like, and our then education secretary warned in universities that he would cut their fees if they didn't go back to face, or face fines. It's like, and the kind of whole narrative around it is that, online learning is it's inferior and lazy and just not as good. And so I kind of want to push back against that. And I think it's interesting to think about all the metaphors we don't see and all the ways that our thinking is shaped, we just kind of become used to. And one of those, I think, is think about kind of what the physical architecture of a campus university does for us. So when you go online, when you develop courses that are fully online, you really have to do a lot of learning design kind of work up front, thinking about how it's going to be structured. And part of the reason we do that is because the physical architecture on a campus university does all that work for us, or a lot of that work. So you go to a certain place to receive content, that's your kind of lecture at a certain time. You go to another place for resources, the library. You maybe go to another room for discussion, which is set up as a seminar room. Students go to other areas for social interactions. And they're all cues that are given off by these physical architectures. And it also does a lot of the organisation work. So I think when you move online, you have to kind of explicitly replicate a lot of that work and a lot of that organisation. And there's also quite a lot of responsibility on the learners then, the architecture isn't doing the work for them either. They kind of have to organise their own work. And I think it's also a question around investment. People are happy to spend 10 million or whatever to put up a fancy new building with their name on the front, but would they invest 10 million pounds in their online architecture? And perhaps I'm harsh here, but also sometimes there's a bit of ego involved from principals, whatever, that it's nice to have a new building that's going to stand forever that that you've put there. And I think it's important to realise that online architecture requires as much effort, but it's different, and I think we need to recognise that. So this idea that it's kind of easy or simple or cheap, we need to kind of overcome that. Okay, I was going to give you the intermission here. How long have we been going? That's okay. We've been going about an hour, so you can get up, move around, do come back. It's going to be about 5 minutes. Maybe if you want a comfort break, go for it. So just before I play this, I ran a conference a couple of weeks ago called OER 22, and we run this project called GoGN, which for some reason Penguins have become the kind of visual brand for. And Brian Mather's developed these videos for us. So ignore the logo. I didn't have time to replace it with a Otessa one, but just enjoy the penguin.
Oh, is there supposed to be sound? We don't hear the sound. It's funky music. I remember seeing it before.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. You should have brought your daughter in for that, Terry. That would have been the highlight. Cool, thanks. It would be good to give you a little intermission. Cool, thanks. Oh, there you're on again. So I'm just going to talk through some metaphors now that crop up in the book, and say the point here really, I think, is to kind of give you a feel for how metaphors could help us think about education technology. So that the book contains quite a wide range of metaphors. And I'll come on to some of the problems about choosing metaphors later as well. But hopefully there'll be something in there that will appeal to people. The first one I'm going to talk about is a sporting one, so apologies if you're not in sport, but I think that doesn't really matter. So for those of you who watch football, soccer, you'll know that they introduced VAR, video assisted refereeing, in the past couple of years. And I think it's kind of really interesting analogy with how we use very precise technology in education here. So in many ways, it was seen the inevitable and desired, the implementation of video assisted referee. So a video assisted referee means that the referee on the decision can make the referee on the pitch can make a decision, but it might be overturned by some experts sitting, watching in another room, watching videos on slow motion of the incident. And people made a very good case, that everyone in the stadium has mobile phones, they're watching on TV. The only person who doesn't have video is actually the most important person, the referee. And there were lots of examples where goals were disallowed that were kind of a long way over the line and stuff. And so everyone kind of said we need to have video, video involved in football, and that was great. Okay, we'll do that, but its implementation has been not at all trouble free. And I think one of the things that we've seen like goals being disallowed, if you care about this stuff, but people sort of being offside by like a toenail. It's like, oh no, that's offside. And I think what that illustrates, football or all sport is a kind of very human endeavor. And I think education is a messy human endeavor. And we can now apply very minute measurements to these things. So learning analytics allows to say, this person has, interacted 0.03 more than this person over here. What does that mean and stuff? And I think, I'm not sure those minute measurements actually work to our benefit. And I think we can be sort of misguided and deluded that because we can measure stuff finely, that's a useful thing to do. And in football, it's kind of hasn't got rid of controversy. It's just kind of relocated that controversy. Instead of being angry with the referee, people are now angry with the video referee. And I think similarly with learning analytics, you can now be angry at the algorithms rather than the educator. And I think it's interesting that it didn't fix the problems that people thought it was going to come in and fix. We're not all living in some kind of controversy-free utopia now in sport. It's like it's just as controversial as it used to be. And so I think we need to think very carefully about when introducing technologies. And I've picked learning analytics, but it could apply to other things. But I think, what are the problems you're trying to solve here? And will it actually solve those problems? I mentioned blockchain earlier, and I saw an article last year saying that blockchain will allow us to kind of reinvent assessment, because we can assess small chunks of things now and put them on the blockchain. We could do that before with ePortfolio. So what is blockchain doing for you now that we couldn't do before? So I think you need to ask those questions. I think another issue is that the technology undermines the humans involved. So I think we've seen cases where referees are reluctant to give a decision. They're worried they will be overruled by the video. And similarly, I think we see cases where tutors or educators are sometimes maybe reluctant to apply lenience to students because it will look bad on their analytics about return rates or scores, those kind of things. And so I think, and I think the thing is, there's no turning back there. We're not going to go away from having VAR. And I guess we're not going to go away from having learning analytics. But I think it does kind of demonstrate how you need to implement these sympathetically and not just be led by the technology. So apologies if you don't like sport, that's the sport one out of the way. So the VLE or LMS, depending on your preferred terminology, I think this is an example of where a metaphor really shapes, I think, how people think about a technology. Going off the work of Farrelly, Costello and Donlon here, we wrote a paper about a metaphorical history of VLEs. And then they sort of went through lots of papers that have been written about VLEs and tried to categorize the different metaphors that have been used. So they suggested, a straitjacket VLE seems very constraining. So some people might say they want to be innovative, use blogs. The wild web look like this kind of closed garden. And these VLEs these metaphors aren't necessarily exclusive. You can have more than one in your head. A behemoth, this thing that it's kind of a big process that dominates things, for either externally or within your institution. So I've talked about this kind of digital sediment that builds up around a VLE, because suddenly, if you want to do anything, it's couched in terms of the VLE roadmap, and the only processes you have in place are VLE related, and the educational technology you have are the VLE people. So it becomes this kind of big thing that kind of has its own momentum. Some people talk about it as a digital car park, so it's kind of just a repository or a place you put stuff, just to go there. a safe space, kind of a walled garden, security blanket, a smorgasbord or a toolbox. And they offer this range of tools that have been gathered together for you, and a pathfinder. So VLEs are this kind of Trojan horse. So you might implement a VLE which gets you up to a certain stage very quickly with e-learning, but then you use that to go on and do other things. So, and you could probably come up with your own, you probably do have in your own head your metaphors for a VLE. And I think it's interesting sometimes when you sit down and talk to people about a VLE, they'll probably have one or two of these metaphors in the head operating. And even if they don't voice it explicitly, it will shape the conversation you're having. And I think that it can be interesting because sometimes you might all be coming from very different angles about what you think a VLE is. And if you're coming from quite opposing metaphors and you're not going to agree, sometimes I think it's really useful to kind of surface what are the mental models that people have about these things. A metaphor that I quite like is the idea of digital mudlarking. So here I'm thinking about educational technology as a field or a discipline or what it is, whatever you want to call it. And we had a really good discussion about this a few years ago. Audrey Walters wrote a piece about EdTech as an undisciplined. So the idea is that it shouldn't be constrained like a discipline is. And I thought of mudlarks. So mudlarks, particularly kind of in Victorian England, along the coast of the Thames, would be sort of poor kids who would struggle to find bits and bobs that are washed up on the Thames. There's also been a kind of renaissance about mudlarking recently. And there's a really good modern book about a woman who goes mudlarking, people using metal detectors and stuff, and people trying to find interesting artifacts and stuff. And I think that's a really interesting thing about the kind of analogy for educational technology there. So educational technology is subject to kind of rapid changes often, and I've mentioned that historical amnesia that prompted me to write the other book. And I think those rapid changes can be seen similar to kind of like a tidal river. So if something comes in and it washes away everything that's gone before, and then as it goes out again, it deposits some stuff, some nuggets. And I think that's kind of where we come in as educational technologists. Our jobs are to be digital mudlarkers, to go in and try and find those interesting artifacts. So before micro-credentials or blockchain or whatever it is we're into this year, or the online pivot, there were MOOCs. MOOCs come in as a big wave, swept before it, and then have gone away again. Not gone away, they kind of sort of receded in terms of the kind of attention they get. But there was some good research that was done at that time. I think our role as educational technologists is to find those good bits of research that are then applicable to other things before it kind of swept away again. So think of yourself as being out there digging in the mud to find the nuggets. Okay, this one is, again, one of my slightly ranty, shouting into the void ones. There's a very strange tendency, well, I think it's strange, in a lot of kind of technology and education technology to take the latest hot thing and just say that for technology. So we see Netflix for learning, Airbnb for education, or Uber for education, these kind of things. And it's like, we'll take that model and apply it to education. And it's often tied up with this idea of unbundling, so taking the component parts of education and selling them off as different pieces, different things. And it's often portrayed as to go back to the reason I wrote that 25 years book, about how us poor people who work in higher education simply don't understand technology, and it needs people to come in from the outside, charging on the white horses and tell us you need to be like Uber and stuff. And it ignores quite a lot of stuff. So for a start, a lot of these models, the most significant thing about them, they have really bad labor practices. They kind of undermine stuff, and really bad business models that are just based on trying to get a monopoly and crush everyone else. There's lots of stuff about Uber, for instance, about how their model works and how they don't give good pay for drivers or union or pensions. Those kind of things. I think what's really interesting about them is they, and I mentioned at the start, when you do this kind of mapping from a metaphor from the source domain to the target domain, only some things map across. And I think what's interesting about these metaphors is why they're not like education. So take that. So there are quite a few examples of the Uber for education one. And so it's interesting why getting an Uber ride is not like education. very at the start, an Uber ride, a taxi ride, it's usually a short thing. You don't need to invest a lot in it. Whereas an education takes a long time frame. You want to make sure you get it right. You could be studying for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. Getting a taxi, an Uber is pretty similar the world over. There's a bit of change in local colour, but it's pretty similar. Whereas education is often very diverse across disciplines or geographically, culturally, how people undertake it. So it's not the same thing. Being licensed to offer formal credit for learning is a very complex, highly regulated process. Getting a car driving license, there's a process to go through, but an awful lot more people have a driving license than they do have, an ability to offer formal credit. So, it's a very highly regulated business. So it's not really replacing the same thing. It's not working on the same pool. There's this idea of Meno's paradox is that, learners don't know what it is that they need to learn. And so you need someone to sort of guide them, and that's the expert. Whereas if I'm getting a taxi, I know where I need to go. It's a fairly simple transaction. Learning is often a very social activity. Getting a taxi isn't necessarily. So you want whole structures around how you interact with other people. And I think it's also important to point out education is already engaging with online learning and mobile delivery, all those kind of things. So what is the problem that Uber for Education is solving for us that was meant to solve for the taxi industry? So I think once you start looking at those reasons why it's not like education, actually you think it's not a very good model at all, is it? No. So just look out for those, whatever the latest hot technology is, models for education. Okay, one to Jaws. So this is an example of how take anything you want in the world and force it to be an education technology metaphor. But actually, when I started doing it, I had a lot of fun. So I'm a big Jaws fan. I've got a mug, I've got the book, I've got the poster. But I started to think about Jaws in relation to the online pivot that we've been through in the pandemic. And so you could really think about in the film, for those who've seen it, a shark terrorizes a local community. And you can think of the shark as the virus in this case. And what that did in the film, what it does is it exposes existing frailties. They rely on summer dollars to make a profit. And I think in the higher education, we saw that suddenly lots of universities were relying on overseas students to be viable and stuff. And things, the whole kind of model of bringing people to one physical location was a real weakness and lack of robustness in the higher education model. So this thing that suddenly arrives and causes a catastrophe actually exposes existing weaknesses that were there all along. And I think there's a famous quote in Jaws where the mayor says those beaches will be open on the 4th of July. That need to have it open on the 4th of July, kind of regardless of the risk. It is paramount because that's where the money comes from. And I think that we saw, that echoed by political leaders like Boris Johnson and Trump, we're going to keep going. But we did see a similar thing with lots of universities wanting to kind of just stay on the campus model for as long as possible because that's how they operate. So those campuses will be open on the 4th of July. In the film, there are 3 main protagonists. Brody is the cop, Hoop is the expert, and Quint is the kind of macho shark hunter. And I think you could say they're kind of analogous to learners, educators, and commerce here. And in the film, spoiler, only 2 of them return from the hunting trip where they go fishing with the shark. And I think you could argue that maybe after the post-pandemic, only 2 of those groups will be particularly well satisfied, and it's up to us to think about which 2 we're going to have. And also, Jaws 2 gave us the perfect tagline, I think, for this period in the pandemic, which is just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water, but in this case, just when you thought it was safe to go back to campus. So, if you want to stretch a metaphor, there's a good example. So, onto that bit that I was going to ask you about, the interactivity part. So, I want your best, worst EdTech or just educational metaphors. Hit me. Terry, I'll let you read some out for me.
I will. EdTech as a chia pet. Give some people some time. I was thinking, oh my God, Hattie.
Show the penguin video quick, Tim.
Come here with it. I always like to think this is going to be very Canadian specific, but micro credentials are the diamond shreddies of education.
What's a diamond shreddy?
So shreddies are
like the breakfast cereal.
They're just squares, right? And hilariously, they released diamond shreddies, as in like you shift it, and then they released the combo packs that had the squares and the diamonds. And
wow, guys,
this is funny marketing, but that's what I think of micro credentials.
Yeah, just repackaging the same thing.
I want a banana.
Oh, everybody, Hattie wants a banana, just so you know.
Enjoy your banana.
The captioning said child in the background. Okay, buddy, it's here. I'm gonna mute and Valerie, someone can read out.
Sure, I'm here to take it. I was actually thinking about the walled garden that people talk about with the LMS, and it implies the garden being good on the inside, that rich space, but then the contrast with these, I vision like big, tall, like Berlin Wall-esque kind of things that, aren't necessarily a good thing. It feels ominous against the garden.
I grew up, did you read that book, The Secret Garden? Like kind of Victorian spooky book when I was young. So like, a walled garden could be a place of menace as well.
Valerie, there are some metaphors in the chat box, but the most interesting also articulated by George and Jim, EdTech is a banana.
That's probably true, actually. A banana skin, potentially, or it's got good stuff on the outside. Yeah, it's on the inside, the outside could be dangerous.
And it's a weapon if you're into Mario Kart.
Or
that's true.
Novelty effect. It's nice and fresh when it's, and then it gets soggy and mushy.
Yeah, good.
More time with it.
Yeah.
Not so novel and great.
Cool.
Or this
Thank you.
Costco bananas, which are strangely like not yet ripe, but also overripe somehow. I don't know how they do it.
Okay. Well, are there any? Otherwise, I'll move on.
Another thing, there is a word, a magical word, digital. For example, if I say banana, it's not interesting. But if I say digital banana, it's quite interesting.
Suddenly it's modern and interesting, you're right.
It transforms everything in a sudden, digital.
Absolutely. Right, okay, thank you. So I'll have a look at some of those later. Cool. So I wanted to talk about some of the dangers of metaphors as well. They're very powerful. That's kind of a good thing about them. They help you understand stuff, but they're very powerful. So they can help you. So they can, really influence how we're thinking, and that can lead to areas or solutions or things that before we even realise we're kind of knee deep in a metaphor. They often go unnoticed, so people talk in kind of metaphorical terms, and it just seems kind of a natural way to talk about a topic. And unless you sort of like explicitly see that that's a metaphor, it can help shape what you're doing. I think one of the really interesting things, they're kind of part of their power is, you mentioned having a Canadian specific one, Terry, and I think that's part of the interesting thing. So you can have metaphors that work very good locally, and in my book I sort of struggled a lot with this. I didn't want to be guilty of kind of like cultural plagiarism, sort of diving in and using metaphors from all over the place. And at the same time, I didn't want it to exclude people by using metaphors that were so limited to my own experience or something. So I think it's getting that balance right can be tricky. And I think often you'll see people do this. I use soccer there, and I think that some people might feel excluded by this. And sometimes I think the metaphor can be sort of overpowering in a way. So some of you may remember from a few years ago the idea of edgy-punk. And I think a lot of people found that quite off-putting. If they weren't into punk, they just found it, middle-aged men going on about how great punk was, kind of thing, and regardless of what it was trying to say about educational technology. If I was to use, a children's cartoon in the UK from the 1980s as a metaphor, from the people who know that, oh, that's great, brilliant. But if you don't know it, you're kind of immediately excluded from what that helps you understand. So I think trying to find metaphors that work for you within your context is a tricky thing to get right. They're imperfect. That's kind of the point of them. So otherwise, they would be the same thing. But it's important to notice where they're imperfect, I think. And I think you can always find an opposite metaphor that will tell you almost the opposite. And sometimes that's a useful thing to do. Like, I've got a metaphor that tells me that this technology is great. I could probably find a metaphor that tells me it's awful as well. And maybe that's a useful thing to play with as well. So metaphors, useful, but approach with caution, I think. And I just wanted to talk about creativity and playfulness as well, I think. And I mentioned before, I think a lot of the work we do in education technology is very much bound in doing functional specifications, user requirements, all those kind of things, spreadsheets, roadmaps, things like that. And that's great, that's useful, but I think it can remove us from how we think about technology a lot. And I think there's room for creative thinking in here as well. And I think that really helps us improve our critical thinking about how we approach technology. So I think Maha's going to talk about in her talk. I think going to use a metaphor to really help us think about how we approach technology and its relationship to us as human beings. So I think amongst the kind of playful metaphors, I think it's important to think about how it can help us really kind of analyze a technology in more detail, and I say humanize our relationship with it. Often it seems like we're kind of powerless before this big technology coming towards us, and I think it helps us sort of like sort of rebalance that relationship. I think most importantly, it encourages discussion. It's a really useful thing to sit around in a room and say, I think the VLE is like this, and someone goes, oh no, I don't think I think it's like this, or whatever. So I think you could imagine, alongside your various things you might be running in your institution, rollout plans, stakeholder briefings and stuff, would it be useful to run metaphor workshops? Would that be a ridiculous idea? If it is a ridiculous idea, would it not be accepted? Why is that? What's our metaphors for this technology we're developing? How do we see it working for us? So I'll end on this message. Fun is not illegal, okay? It may seem that way sometimes, and I think we have to be very mindful to be critical, I think, and I think really engage in this space critically, and hold companies to power, and things like proctoring companies and stuff. We've seen lots of dodgy practice there. So it's not all just about fun, but I think it's okay to have some fun in this space. So here's some fun bits. The 25 years remix, if you want to go and play that. The metaphor generator I've done there, and some blog posts there, I think. But I think just try and think about how it can maybe re-energize some of your approach to education technology. And last slide. Thank you. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here, as I say, and I think it's a great conference. I'm really looking forward to digging into the rest of it. Some of the things we might want to discuss are what role of metaphor is most relevant for you. I mentioned those 3 ways that I sort of phrased the book around understanding, helping understanding, that kind of defense against things might be sold or framed, or creativity, and how might you use metaphor in your practice? So maybe those could be some things we discuss, but I'm open for any questions. So I'm going to stop sharing now, Terry, and over to you.
I think before we go to questions, Terry and Aris, how about we unmute our mics and make as much applause and loud thank yous as possible?
Huzzah!
On behalf of all the people here, thank you so much.
I'm just making my critical digital banana remixer here. Sorry.
That's right. That's what we need.
Oh, and I just got a banana handed to me.
This was a turning point for the Terry, because he started to write his book about digital bananas, right?
Sorry, I missed that. Hattie was shouting.
You're writing a book, apparently, Terry. Is that right?
I missed that. Sorry, I'm writing a book about
Digital bananas.
digital bananas. Yeah, I'm working on the cover right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
When's the book out?
Should be June.
Awesome. Should be, but it will be.
I think so. We need to just do the edits. I think that it might be a bit tight for doing, but hopefully it will be. Yeah.
I can't wait.
In time for your summer holidays to read on the beach, of course. What could be better?
I would absolutely.
Dear Martin, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please do.
What is your metaphor for the metaverse?
No, maybe my metaphor is another technology. Maybe it's just the 2022 version of Second Life.
Thank you. People, believe metaverse will change the whole world, not on educational level.
No.
Looks like we have a question from Maha. Can you think of an example of a metaphor that was culturally inappropriate or misunderstood that you've used before?
Actually, yeah, this goes back a really long way, and I think it shows how stupid I was. So when I was doing my PhD, I was part of a European project, and we were developing an expert system, so AI for the aluminium die casting industry, which is as exciting as it sounds. So I was into the idea of icons. I thought we ran out of language because it was meant to sort of show animations and stuff. And I was trying to think of an icon to show when you clicked on the button, the system would go away and think. And I did one of Sherlock Holmes with his deer stalker hat on and pipe. And of course, all my European colleagues just went, "What's that meant to represent? What's that?" I was, "Oh yeah, that's what it's there." So yeah, absolutely. So Helen says,
10 minutes.
Should we avoid using them when they merge, or should we even try? I think you should definitely engage with them, but I think as long as people are aware that it is a metaphor, I think that's the kind of thing. Often people talk to you as if that's obvious. It's like I've got a chapter in the book called "Education is Broken," and that in itself is a metaphor. You took because broken comes with lots of connotations about it's unfixable. It needs something else to come in, and it needs a radical change. It's a very different thing from saying education is evolving. So I think just if people are using metaphors and using them as this is an accepted fact, then I think that's worth challenging people on. But I think as long as if you're being, let's think about them in terms of metaphors to explore an idea and do stuff, then I think that's a very productive thing.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How many metaphors do you think you had in your pocket when you're like, I should write a book about this? When did you get there?
Yeah, so like the 25 years book, I think I was sort of going along, and the subtitle of my blog is overstretched metaphors about educational technology. So it's something that I've probably got enough here to start writing a book, and that's quite useful. I don't want to write a book from scratch. I could go through and just clog together a load of blog posts, and that sort of gets you started at least. I think
it must have been the seal of the deal one was how juicy the Jaws one was. I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. That really helped. But actually, I think it came out of the pandemic. I think particularly, I think that sort of seeing how restricted people were and how they thought about online learning, and in many ways, the lecture as your model for online learning is a metaphor itself. This is how we're going to conduct it. We conduct it like this thing we do face to face.
Martin, there's a question from George. There's quite a bit of evidence on the power of storytelling. Is there similar evidence for metaphors?
Yeah. Yes, that's all I'm going to say. But there is quite a lot of work around metaphors, particularly metaphors in education. And there are lots of metaphors of education. And often when people approach education, they come to it with a kind of metaphor in place. Yeah. So, but yeah, it's a metaphor, so storytelling, narrative, other kind of two main ways to approach the topic.
I have one from an anonymous attendee. Metaphors have been very prevalent in various open movements. We talk about paywalls, information commons, etc. I wonder whether you think these metaphors have helped or hindered advocacy.
I think it's a really good point, actually, and I think a lot of the open stuff it needs to use metaphors because it's a new thing, and you're trying to explain it to people to understand it. So it's that understanding role, but at the same time, any metaphor that people then get, you've then limited a kind of different branch. And I think the idea around OERs as kind of free things you might reuse, or and the whole thing often came from the idea of learning objects, which themselves have come from a computer science world, and all those things kind of come laden with a certain understanding. And I think sometimes now, when we're trying to move to perhaps more think about open pedagogy, open educational practice, that's a different type of thing. And I think sometimes people have become bounded much more about the resource, the stuff, the thing, and all that goes along with it, rather than the kind of practice. So yeah, it's absolutely. So I think it's that metaphors are dangerous but exciting.
That kind of connects to Anne-Marie Scott's blog post that was circling on social media about we need the learning technologists. It's less mentioning the stuff there.
Yeah,
people.
There is an interesting comment from Suzanne Kohonen. I mean, probably Eurovision. I mean, it is known at the European side, but if you are not familiar at North America, it might not be meaningful. But she says the Norway Eurovision performance is a great metaphor.
I didn't see it, so I'll see what they will. Yeah, that's it exactly. But that Susanna mentions old stories. So if you have that kind of shared cultural knowledge about fairy tales and myths, then metaphors are kind of really powerful. But if you don't have that, then you're excluded from them. So
it's like mudlarking.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I have to explain I have to explain what a mudlark is. First of all, but I think in some ways that's just fun as well. So you can explain what those things are, and you don't need to go into too much detail for people to get it.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
Yeah, there was talk about icing the puck as well, which would exclude most people other than hockey fans and Canadians.
Wonderful.
Is the wolf and the grandma, is that Red Riding Hood, basically? Is that story?
Yes, so.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. There we are. We made it to nearly 90 minutes. When I saw I had a 90-minute slot, I was thinking, that's a long. Hence the dancing penguins, but I hope you appreciated those at least.
That's lovely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great start to our conference, and it's wonderful to welcome you into our community, and hope you'll come back next year when we apparently will be face-to-face in Toronto.
Nice. Cool.
University as a host, but we will keep online options always. But it would be great to get you over here to join us in person. Yeah. So on behalf of everyone here and all the attendees, we see hearts and party emoticons there. So thank you so much. I'll unmute again and give you a round of applause on behalf of everyone here.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Great to be here.
And
Thank you, Martin.
Recorded, and we'll post it on YouTube in time, and it will be available as an archive for the next couple of weeks within the Congress platform. So thank you so much.
Cool.
Is there time to watch Jaws before the next session starts?
I should have given it as pre-work.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone. It is
now
time to drink our digital coffee and break. Everything is
cool.
digital.
Yeah. Thanks. See you all in 30 minutes at the next session.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Okay, we can stop recording if the EdTech has that.
Ready?